working-class family and the kind of routine that many people shared. From the outside, there was little to suggest anything unusual. Neighbors saw a family going about their daily lives, nothing more. But behind closed doors, things were different. Gacy's childhood was shaped by tension and fear. His father was known to be strict and often harsh, and young John struggled to gain his approval. No matter what he did, it never seemed to be enough. This constant need for validation quietly followed him as he grew older. At school, he tried to fit in. He wanted to be liked, to be accepted, to feel like he belonged. Sometimes he succeeded. Other times he felt like an outsider, unsure of where he truly stood. These early years were filled with small moments that, while easy to overlook, slowly built the foundation of who he would become. As time passed, Gacy learned how to present himself to others. He developed a friendly personality, one that could make people feel comfortable around him. He smiled often, laughed easily, and seemed eager to help. To many, he was just another young man trying to find his place in the world. But beneath that surface, something more complicated was taking shape. There were signs, subtle, quiet, easy to miss. Moments of anger, feelings he didn't fully understand, thoughts he never shared. These were not things people saw. They were hidden, tucked away behind a carefully maintained image. As he entered adulthood, Gacy began building a life that looked stable. He worked hard, found opportunities, and slowly gained trust within his community. He learned that if he played his role well enough, no one would question him. And for a long time, no one did. The neighborhood remained quiet. The streets remained calm. Life moved forward as it always does. No one could have imagined what was coming. As John Wayne Gacy grew older, he became something many people admired. A man who seemed dependable, hardworking, and involved in his community. He held jobs that gave him structure and purpose. He worked with determination, often putting in long hours. Over time, he began to build a reputation as someone who could be relied upon. Employers trusted him. Colleagues respected him. But more than that, he became known in his neighborhood. Gacy had a way of making people feel at ease. He spoke with confidence, smiled often, and presented himself as someone who genuinely cared about others. He attended local events, participated in community activities, and appeared to enjoy being around people. To those who knew him, he seemed ordinary, perhaps even kind. He eventually started his own business, taking on responsibilities that further strengthened his image. Running a business requires discipline and organization, and Gacy appeared to handle it well. This only added to the growing belief that he was someone successful and trustworthy. But what truly set him apart was something unusual. Gacy sometimes performed as a clown. Dressed in colorful costumes, he would entertain at parties and events, bringing laughter to children and families. The character he portrayed was cheerful, playful, and full of energy. It was a role that seemed far removed from anything dark or troubling. People saw this and felt reassured. After all, someone who brought joy to others couldn't possibly be dangerous, or so they thought. Behind the smiles and laughter, however, there was a deeper story, one that no one could see. Gacy had learned how to maintain appearances. He understood how to present himself in ways that would prevent suspicion. Every interaction, every conversation, every public moment reinforced the image he had carefully created. And it worked. Neighbors trusted him. Friends welcomed him. The community saw him as one of their own. But as time quietly passed, small cracks began to form. There were moments, brief, almost unnoticeable, when something felt slightly off. A comment that lingered too long. A look that didn't quite match the situation. These moments were easy to dismiss, and most people did. Life continued as normal. No alarms were raised. No questions were asked. And the truth remained hidden. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Life moved forward in its steady rhythm. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. People went about their routines, unaware that something beneath the surface was beginning to change. For John Wayne Gacy, this period marked the beginning of darker thoughts and actions, things he kept entirely to himself. He continued to live his life as expected. He worked, socialized, and maintained the same friendly image everyone had come to know. On the outside, nothing had changed, but internally, something had shifted. There are moments in life where small decisions lead to larger consequences. At the time, they may not seem significant, but over time, they begin to shape a path that becomes harder and harder to leave. For Gacy, these moments began quietly. He spent more time alone, retreating into his own thoughts. The contrast between his public life and his private world grew stronger. The more people trusted him, the easier it became for him to continue without suspicion. This is often how such stories unfold. Not with sudden, dramatic changes, but with gradual steps that go unnoticed. At some point, those steps crossed a line. The first serious actions were hidden carefully. There were no witnesses, no immediate signs that anything was wrong. To the outside world, everything still appeared normal. But for Gacy, there was no turning back. Once a line is crossed, it becomes easier to cross it again. The sense of control, the secrecy, the belief that he could continue without being discovered, these factors combined to create a dangerous pattern. And still, no one knew. The neighborhood remained quiet. The same streets, the same houses, the same routines. People greeted each other, went to work, returned home, and carried on with their lives. All the while, something unsettling was taking place behind closed doors. It is often said that the most frightening truths are the ones hidden in plain sight. And in this case, that was exactly what was happening. The shadows were growing, but they had not yet been seen. At first, the changes were so subtle that they barely registered. A young man didn't return home one evening. Another stopped showing up to work. In a busy city, these things could happen. People moved away. They changed routines. Sometimes, they simply disappeared from one place and reappeared somewhere else. Life went on. Families worried, of course. Friends asked questions. But without clear answers, uncertainty slowly turned into silence. Days became weeks, and the absence of answers made it easier for others to move forward. During this time, John Wayne Gacy continued living as he always had. His business operated normally. He spoke with neighbors. He laughed, shook hands, and remained the same familiar figure people had come to trust. Nothing about him suggested concern, and yet the pattern was quietly forming. The young men who disappeared often had something in common. They were passing through life's transitions, working small jobs, traveling, or trying to build something for themselves. Their paths crossed with many people, making it difficult to trace where things had gone wrong. No one connected the dots. In a world without constant digital tracking, it was easy for someone to fade from view. A missed phone call, a delayed letter, these were not always immediate causes for alarm, so the pattern remained hidden. Gacy understood this. He understood how easily people could overlook what didn't fit into their daily lives. The more time passed, the more confident he became that nothing would point back to him. The neighborhood remained calm, but beneath that calm surface, something deeply unsettling was continuing. Unseen, unspoken, and unnoticed. Over time, however, silence can begin to feel different. What once seemed like isolated events slowly started to raise questions. Families who had waited patiently began to push for answers. They spoke to authorities, shared concerns, and asked for investigations to be taken more seriously. Even then, progress was slow. Missing person cases are often complicated. Without clear evidence, without witnesses, it becomes difficult to determine what truly happened. Each case seemed separate, unconnected to the others, but not everyone was convinced. Some investigators began to notice similarities. The ages, the circumstances, the sudden disappearances without clear explanation. These details, small on their own, started to form a pattern when viewed together. Still, there was nothing concrete. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy continued to maintain his public image. He attended gatherings, spoke confidently, and showed no signs of distress. To those around him, he remained the same dependable man. But as questions slowly grew, so did attention. A few individuals who had crossed paths with Gacy began to recall small details. Conversations, invitations, moments that once seemed ordinary. At the time, they had thought nothing of it. But now, those memories felt slightly different. Unsettling, but unclear. Investigators, working carefully, began to follow these threads. Each lead was explored, each possibility considered. It was a slow process, requiring patience and persistence, and still nothing definitive had been uncovered. But the quiet certainty that something was wrong had begun to settle in. As the questions grew stronger, so did the determination to find answers. Investigators began to look more closely at individuals connected to the missing persons. Names were reviewed, timelines were studied, patterns were examined with greater care. It was during this process that attention gradually turned toward John Wayne Gacy. At first, there was no immediate reason to suspect him. He had no obvious connection to wrongdoing. In fact, his reputation worked in his favor. He was known, respected, and trusted within his community. But investigations often require looking beyond appearances. Some of the missing individuals had last been seen in places connected, however loosely, to Gacy's work or social circle. These connections were not obvious, but they were enough to raise curiosity. So investigators took a closer look. They observed, they listened, they gathered information without drawing attention. Every detail, no matter how small, was noted and considered. Gacy, meanwhile, continued his routine. If he felt pressure, he did not show it. His interactions remained steady, his behavior unchanged. To anyone watching casually, there was nothing unusual to see. But beneath the surface, the investigation was quietly gaining momentum. Authorities began to build a clearer picture, not of certainty, but of possibility. And in cases like this, possibility is often the first step toward truth. The calm neighborhood still showed no signs of what was unfolding, but something had shifted. For the first time, the hidden world behind closed doors was beginning to draw closer to discovery. By now, the investigation had begun to narrow. What once felt like scattered, unrelated disappearances was slowly forming into something more connected. Investigators, working patiently, started to revisit earlier details, conversations, timelines, and overlooked moments. And one name began to appear more than once. John Wayne Gacy. First, it was nothing more than a coincidence. His name surfaced through casual connections. Someone who had offered a job, someone who had been present at a location, someone who had crossed paths briefly with a missing individual. Individually, these connections meant very little, but together they began to form a pattern. Investigators did not rush. They understood the importance of caution. A respected member of the community could not be accused without clear evidence. So instead, they observed quietly, allowing the pieces to come together naturally. They began to study Gacy more closely, his routines, his habits, his interactions with others. To the outside world, nothing had changed. He still appeared friendly, composed, and engaged in everyday life. He spoke confidently, laughed easily, and maintained the same image he had built over the years. But now there were eyes watching more carefully. Small details began to stand out. The way he responded to certain questions, the way he avoided others. None of it was proof, but it was enough to keep attention focused on him. The investigation was no longer searching blindly. It was beginning to move in a direction, and quietly, steadily, that direction was leading closer to the truth. Chapter 8, Watching and Waiting. Surveillance is often a quiet process. There are no sudden movements, no dramatic confrontations, just patience. Investigators rely on time, observation, and careful documentation. Every action, no matter how ordinary, can hold meaning when viewed in the right context. For John Wayne Gacy, life continued as usual. He went to work. He interacted with neighbors. He maintained his routines without interruption. If he noticed anything unusual, he gave no sign of it. But behind the scenes, attention was growing. Investigators began to follow his movements more closely. They noted where he went, who he spoke to, and how he spent his time. These observations were not immediate answers, but they were steps toward understanding. At the same time, they continued to gather information from others. People who had once spoken casually about Gacy now found themselves thinking more carefully about their experiences. Memories that had seemed unimportant began to take on new meaning. Conversation, an invitation, a moment that felt slightly out of place. None of these details alone could explain what was happening, but together they added weight to the growing sense that something was not right. Still, there was no direct evidence, and without it, the investigation could not move forward. So they waited, they watched, they listened, and slowly, piece by piece, the quiet puzzle continued to form. Eventually, the time came to take the next step. Observation alone was no longer enough. Investigators needed something more, something tangible, something that could confirm or deny their growing suspicions. The focus turned toward gathering evidence. This required careful planning. Every move had to be precise, every action justified. There could be no mistakes. John Wayne Gacy remained unaware, or at least appeared to be. His behavior did not change. He continued to present himself as calm, cooperative, and confident, but the pressure was beginning to build. Investigators sought permission to examine areas connected to him more closely. They prepared to look beyond the surface, to explore places that had, until now, remained private and unquestioned. This was a turning point. For a long time, the truth had been hidden behind appearances, routines, and assumptions. But now those layers were beginning to shift. The search for answers was no longer distant. It was approaching something real, something that could not be ignored. The quiet neighborhood still stood as it always had. The same streets, the same houses, the same sense of normal life. But beneath that normality, a discovery was drawing near. And once revealed, it would change everything. The investigation had reached a critical moment. For weeks, perhaps longer, investigators had been gathering small pieces of information. Details that, on their own, meant very little. But now, those pieces were beginning to align. A clearer picture was forming. The focus on John Wayne Gacy was no longer based on possibility alone. There was now enough concern to take a closer step forward, one that required both caution and certainty. Permission was granted to examine his property more carefully. This was not a decision made lightly. It required evidence, planning, and the understanding that what they might find could change everything. When investigators arrived, everything appeared ordinary. The house stood quietly, just like any other in the neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested what might lie beneath the surface. It was clean, organized, and familiar. Exactly what one would expect from someone with Gacy's reputation. But appearances can be deceiving. As they began their work, investigators paid attention to every detail. They moved slowly, carefully, making sure nothing was overlooked. Each room was observed, each space considered. At first, there was nothing unusual, but then subtle signs began to emerge. Small things, things that might not have meant anything before. But now, under careful examination, they felt different. The air of certainty began to shift. Something was there, something hidden, and for the first time, investigators were closer than ever to uncovering it. Some truths are not immediately visible. They remain hidden, not because they are impossible to find, but because they require patience, persistence, and a willingness to look deeper. As investigators continued their search, their attention turned to areas of the home that were less obvious, spaces that most people would overlook. And it was there that things began to change. What they discovered was not immediately clear, but it was enough to confirm one thing. This was no longer just a possibility. It was real. The calm image that had surrounded John Wayne Gacy for so long began to break apart. The trusted figure, the friendly neighbor, the man who entertained others. All of it started to feel distant from the truth that was emerging. Investigators worked carefully, documenting everything. There was no rush. Each step had to be handled with precision. The goal was not just to find answers, but to understand them fully. Outside, life continued as normal. Neighbors went about their day, unaware of the significance of what was unfolding nearby. The quiet streets remained unchanged, even as something deeply unsettling was being uncovered within one of its homes. Inside, however, everything was different. The investigation had moved beyond suspicion. It had entered the realm of discovery. And with that discovery came a realization, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. There comes a moment in every investigation when uncertainty is replaced by clarity. For those working on this case, that moment had arrived. The evidence, once scattered and incomplete, now pointed in a single direction. The questions that had lingered for so long were finally being answered. Not all at once, but enough to understand the reality of the situation. John Wayne Gacy was no longer just a name in the background. He was at the center. The discovery made within his home confirmed what had once seemed impossible. The disappearances, the unanswered questions, the quiet concerns. They were all connected. What had been hidden for so long was now coming into the light. For investigators, this was both a breakthrough and a heavy realization. The truth they had been searching for was not simple, and it was not easy to process. Carried weight both in its meaning and in its impact. Steps were taken quickly after that. The process moved forward, guided by the evidence that had been uncovered. What had once been a quiet investigation was now becoming something much larger. And still, the neighborhood remained the same. The same houses, the same streets, the same calm appearance. But everything had changed, because now the truth was known. And once the truth is known, it cannot be hidden again. Once the truth began to surface, events moved quickly. Investigators, now certain of what they had uncovered, took the next necessary step. There was no longer room for doubt. The evidence had spoken clearly, and action could no longer be delayed. John Wayne Gacy was taken into custody. For someone who had spent years maintaining control, this moment marked a sudden and irreversible change. The carefully constructed life he had built, the business, the reputation, the trust, began to fall away all at once. To the outside world, the news spread rapidly. People who had once known him struggled to understand what they were hearing. Neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances found it difficult to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the reality that was now being revealed. It did not seem possible, and yet it was true. The quiet neighborhood, once defined by routine and familiarity, became the center of attention. Questions filled the air. How could something like this happen here? How could it go unnoticed for so long? There were no simple answers. For investigators, however, the focus remained clear. The arrest was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase. There was still much to understand, much to document, and much to bring forward. For Gacy, the silence he had once controlled was gone. In its place was something very different. Accountability. The impact of the arrest reached far beyond a single home. As the news became widely known, the community began to process what had happened. People who had lived ordinary lives found themselves connected to something deeply unsettling. It was not just the events themselves that caused shock. It was the realization that it had all taken place so close to home. Neighbors looked at familiar streets with new eyes. Places that once felt safe now carried a different meaning. Conversations changed. People spoke more carefully, more thoughtfully, trying to understand how such a reality could exist alongside everyday life. Many remembered their interactions with John Wayne Gacy, the friendly conversations, the public appearances, the sense of normalcy he had projected. These memories, once ordinary, now felt distant and difficult to process. Trust, once given easily, became something more complicated. For families connected to the victims, the moment was even more profound. After so much uncertainty, there was finally clarity, but it came with a heavy emotional weight. Answers had been found, but they were not the kind anyone had hoped for. Still, there was a sense that the truth, however difficult, was necessary. It allowed the process of understanding and eventually healing to begin. The community, though shaken, slowly started to adjust to this new reality. But nothing would ever feel quite the same again. With the arrest made, the focus shifted toward the legal process. Investigators worked to organize the evidence they had gathered. Every detail needed to be clear, documented, and presented in a way that could stand up to careful examination. This was no simple task. The case was complex, involving many layers that had developed over time. Each piece of information had to be placed in context, forming a complete and accurate account of what had occurred. Meanwhile, John Wayne Gacy remained at the center of it all. For the public, the case became a subject of intense attention. People followed developments closely, trying to make sense of the situation. News spread beyond the local community, reaching a much wider audience. The story, once hidden, was now fully visible. In court, the process moved forward step by step. There were procedures to follow, arguments to be made, and decisions to be reached. It was a system designed to ensure that the truth was examined carefully and fairly. For those involved, it required patience. Justice is not immediate. It unfolds over time, shaped by evidence, testimony, and careful consideration. And so the case continued. Each day brought new developments, new understanding, and new clarity. The quiet life that had once surrounded this story was gone. In its place was a moment of reckoning, one that would define how the story would be remembered for years to come. After the arrest, the case moved into the courtroom. For many, the trial was a time of questions. What had truly happened? How could someone lead a life that seemed so ordinary while hiding such a dark reality? The proceedings were carefully organized. Lawyers presented evidence. Witnesses shared what they knew. Every detail was examined slowly, deliberately, to ensure clarity and fairness. John Wayne Gacy remained composed in court. To some, this was surprising. To others, it was consistent with the person they had observed in daily life. Calm, controlled, and precise. Outside the courtroom, families and community members watched closely. They wanted answers, and they hoped for understanding. Each day of testimony added more pieces to the puzzle, allowing the public and the victims' families to see what had previously been hidden. Though the details were serious, the courtroom atmosphere emphasized justice over spectacle. Every step was deliberate, measured, and focused on uncovering the truth rather than inciting fear. By the end of the first weeks, the story that had been whispered and suspected for years was now being told clearly, carefully, and without exaggeration. After months of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. The courtroom waited quietly as the jury delivered its decision. Each member had listened, considered, and reflected on the evidence presented. Now, the moment of clarity had arrived. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty. For the families of the victims, this brought a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because the truth had been acknowledged and justice was beginning to take shape. Sorrow because no verdict could undo the loss and uncertainty they had endured. The community, too, felt a shift. People who had lived near Gacy for years began to process what had happened in their own neighborhoods. The calm streets had hidden a secret, but now the truth was part of history. Even in the aftermath, life slowly returned to routine. Yet, the story remained. A reminder that appearances can be misleading and that patience, observation, and diligence are crucial when seeking answers. The verdict marked the end of the trial, but the lessons of the case continued to resonate. Looking back, the story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about crime. It is about awareness, trust, and vigilance. It teaches that people are often more complex than they appear. Some can maintain calm, orderly lives while hiding serious secrets. Others may notice small, unusual details but not fully understand their significance until much later. Communities learn in subtle ways from such events. They learn to pay attention to patterns, to listen carefully, and to value communication and honesty. For families affected, the process of reflection is ongoing. Healing does not happen immediately, and understanding takes time. Yet, even in the darkest stories, there is a chance to recognize the importance of empathy, patience, and careful observation. And for anyone listening to or reading about this story, it is a reminder that history is full of lessons. By observing, questioning, and reflecting, people can navigate a complex world with greater awareness and care. Even in a story as unsettling as this one, there is a way to take away insight without sensationalizing, without fear, simply learning from the truths that emerge when we look closely. After the trial, the story of John Wayne Gacy became a part of history, a cautionary tale for communities, families, and individuals alike. Though the events were unsettling, the lessons they offered were important. One of the most notable was the need for awareness. Small signs, often overlooked, can hold significance when viewed over time. The case also highlighted the importance of trust and caution. People naturally assume the best of those around them, but this story reminded everyone that appearances do not always reveal the full truth. Awareness, careful observation, and communication with others are valuable tools in keeping communities safe. Additionally, the story offered perspective on resilience. Families affected by loss found strength in the search for answers. Communities learned to process shock and fear while supporting each other, and investigators demonstrated the power of patience, diligence, and attention to detail in uncovering the truth. Even though the events were dark, the story allowed people to grow in understanding and awareness. It emphasized that truth often emerges through calm persistence and careful thought, rather than through haste or assumption. And slowly, over time, life moved forward. Streets became ordinary again. Neighbors returned to routines. But the lessons of observation, awareness, and care remained quietly in the background, guiding those who remembered. In the end, the story of John Wayne Gacy is a reminder that the world is complex, and that people are often more layered than they seem. For those who lived near him, for those who followed the case, and for anyone hearing this story today, there is a sense of closure in knowing that the truth came to light. Justice, in its own way, was served, and the careful work of investigators ensured that the hidden events were finally understood. Yet, there is also a quiet reminder. Life continues. Normalcy returns and communities rebuild. Calm resumes and people find a way to carry on. And in that calm, there is space for reflection, learning, and awareness. Stories like this one are not just about fear. They are about paying attention, understanding patterns, and valuing truth. They are about seeing the world clearly, while maintaining the ability to trust, care, and live fully. So, as the streets return to quiet, and the sun rises on another day, we can remember the story, reflect on the lessons, and move forward, mindful, aware, and thoughtful. And in that reflection, there is peace. Dyatlov, a determined and skilled young man who had already led smaller hiking trips. The group consisted of students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, all sharing a love for adventure and the outdoors. Their plan was to reach Otorten Mountain, navigating through snowy landscapes and harsh conditions. Each carried essential equipment: skis, tents, sleeping bags, and supplies to last the journey. Spirits were high, and the group looked forward to the challenge, knowing that winter hiking demanded teamwork, preparation, and endurance. The trail they followed was both familiar and unpredictable. The Ural Mountains were known for sudden weather changes, deep snow, and icy slopes, but the group was confident in their skills. They kept journals, documented their progress, and communicated regularly, sending messages to the outside world whenever possible. As they advanced deeper into the mountains, the scenery became more isolated. Pine trees gave way to rocky slopes, and the biting cold became more intense. The group followed safety measures carefully, setting up camp in places that seemed sheltered from the elements. They worked together to manage firewood, food, and equipment. Despite the challenges, laughter and camaraderie filled their days. They played in the snow, skied together, and shared meals around a small stove. Every night, they recorded notes about the journey and the landscape. Every sunrise brought a renewed determination to reach their destination. It was a journey meant to test their limits, strengthen friendships, and experience the beauty of winter wilderness. They did not know, however, that this expedition would soon become a story that would puzzle the world for decades. As the hikers moved closer to the heart of the Ural Mountains, the terrain grew more demanding. The slopes became steeper, the snow deeper, and the winds harsher. The weather was unpredictable, with blizzards that could appear without warning. Despite the dangers, the group remained focused. They relied on maps, compasses, and experience to navigate through the rugged landscape. Each member knew the importance of teamwork and caution, yet they were determined to reach their intended campsite. The mountains were both breathtaking and intimidating. Frozen rivers sparkled in the sunlight, while sharp peaks seemed to pierce the sky. Wildlife tracks occasionally appeared in the snow, reminding the hikers of the natural world around them. They moved carefully, mindful of avalanches and other winter hazards. At night, they pitched tents and gathered around small fires. Conversations ranged from future plans to reflections on the day's journey. The cold was ever present, but their preparation kept them safe. They wrote letters, took photographs, and kept a detailed record of their experiences. In the midst of the wilderness, a sense of wonder and achievement filled their hearts. They felt connected to nature and proud of their ability to overcome challenges. But in the background, the mountain remained vast, silent, and indifferent to human presence. It would soon play a role in shaping the events that followed. As days passed, the hikers sent occasional messages to friends and family. The letters conveyed excitement and progress, detailing their route, conditions, and discoveries. They described snowy landscapes, frozen lakes, and the beauty of winter forests. Yet, as the days wore on, contact became irregular. Weather conditions sometimes prevented them from sending messages, and long distances made communication slow. Family and friends waited patiently, not realizing that something unusual was beginning to unfold. The group maintained discipline in their journals, noting each day's route, temperature, and activities. These records would later help investigators piece together their final movements. Each entry reflected careful planning and an appreciation for the challenges of the mountains. The hikers' route grew increasingly remote. They moved further from villages and towns, deeper into territory where help would be far away. The silence of the mountains was both peaceful and isolating, a reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. By the time they approached the area that would later be called Dyatlov Pass, the mountains had shown both their beauty and their unforgiving nature. The hikers were ready for the challenges ahead, unaware that their journey would soon take a tragic and mysterious turn. The hikers continued their journey, moving further into the remote mountains. Each day brought a new layer of challenge. The snow grew heavier, the wind stronger, and the landscape more rugged. Yet, the group remained composed, relying on skill and teamwork to navigate safely. They measured distances, adjusted routes, and maintained careful routines. At each stop, they checked equipment, shared food, and ensured that everyone stayed warm. Their preparation was meticulous, a testament to the experience of each member. Even in the harsh environment, moments of wonder emerged. The sun reflected off frozen surfaces, creating sparkling patterns that stretched for miles. Animal tracks occasionally appeared in the snow, leaving the hikers curious about the unseen creatures of the mountains. They felt a quiet connection to the land. Every slope climbed and every valley crossed brought a sense of accomplishment. The challenge was not just physical, it was a mental test of focus, observation, and endurance. And though the mountains were vast and silent, the hikers moved steadily forward, unaware that the area ahead held mysteries far greater than any challenge they had faced before. As the group approached their intended campsite near the pass, the environment grew even more isolated. Trees gave way to open slopes, and snowdrifts deepened across the terrain. Despite the increasing difficulty, the hikers set up camp with precision. The tents were arranged carefully, facing the direction of prevailing winds. They built fires, organized supplies, and maintained a routine that balanced warmth, rest, and observation of the surroundings. Journals and cameras were set aside for evening notes and photographs. The cold was intense, but the hikers' preparation kept discomfort to a minimum. They shared stories, laughter, and plans for the coming days. There was a calm focus in the group, each member contributing to the safety and success of the expedition. Yet, in the quiet of the mountains, a sense of the unknown lingered. Snow-covered peaks loomed around them, and the pass ahead seemed both inviting and mysterious. Nature's silence pressed in, reminding them that this journey was far from ordinary. Though nothing seemed immediately unusual, subtle changes in weather and terrain hinted at challenges they had yet to encounter. The mountains, majestic and indifferent, held their secret.